Okay, gentlemen, we're looking at chapter 13, milestones of the past century and a changing global landscape. So, as we look through kind of the lens of everything that's going on here, um, we have a lot of things changing. The end of really European empires, uh, those coming to a close, and kind of the arrival of a lot of new independent nations on a global stage is going to mark a very dramatic change without throughout the political landscape of the world. We have the end of the apartheid and white domination in South Africa. Um, the changing with Europe rebuilding a modern economy and moving towards kind of a greater union. You have communism expanding into Eastern Europe, China, Southeast Asia, Cuba. We see the development of the Cold War, the expansion of things like nuclear weapons that have unprecedented power. And we see that at the end of chapter 12, obviously with the dropping of the two atomic bombs. We also see China becoming a much more powerful nation throughout this time period too, and the Middle East really becoming an unstable kind of a place as we look forward. So all these things is the 1950 to present and the change within that global landscape that we see. So recovering from the war, the tragedies really that afflict Europe in the first half of the 20th century, war, economic collapse, the Holocaust, they're all wholly really self-inflicted, and yet the civilization does not permanently collapse whatsoever. Europeans are going to be able to um, really build, okay, upon uh, rebuild their industrial economy, revive the democratic and political systems that were there. The three factors that kind of help explain the recovery itself: the resiliency of an industrial society, one that's really been established throughout time, skills and habits that really take over that. A second factor is in the ability of the major Western European countries to integrate the recovering economies, putting aside some of the kind of issues that were nationalism in return for having enduring peace and prosperity during this time period. And the third was really with the United States, which emerges after 1945 to be really the superpower, the dominant center of Western civilization. So when we look at this, we see the industrial society being very resilient here. We also see the integration of economies with other Western European countries. For instance, the European Economic Community, or the EEC, of 1957 will eventually become the European Union in, excuse me, in 1994. And in 2002, 12 of their members had 12 members, and later increases to 17. And they all adopted a common currency, which was the euro. All of this really sustained Europe's remarkable recovery throughout this time. With the U.S. being a superpower and a global power here, this is another reason as to why Western civilization can grow. The United States gives the Marshall Plan, okay, which was basically an effort that funneled $12 billion, okay, right around the roughly 120 billion today, with numerous advisors and technicians. It looks to kind of combine the rebuilding, okay, of new issues, but also the desire to prevent any type of new depression. We also see at this time its indication of an intent to lead with this. Now, this economic recovery plan is not necessarily going to be available for anyone who is involved with communism. We know that they are trying to have them denounce that ideal there. But Western European economies grow rapidly during this time period as well. We also see NATO coming to power in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It commits the United States and its nuclear arsenal to the defense of Europe against really the Soviet Union, and it firmly anchors West Germany within the Western Alliance as well through that. We see that along with this, the Soviet Union will bring together their own response to NATO as well. Their response is going to be in the Warsaw Pact, that kind of brings together Eastern European countries along with China as a group of people that were there. Also, during this time, we see Japan becoming an economic giant. Between the time of 1950s and 1970s, Japan is really under American occupation between 45 and 52, but they revived their country that was devastated, but they were already industrialized. We understand that. The nation was becoming really this superpower in itself, not necessarily on the same realm as the United States or the Soviet Union or even China for that matter at first. The democratic constitution that was imposed on Japan by the American occupation authorities requires that land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. And that meant Japan, even more so than Europe, depended on the United States for the military security that they had. The Soviet Union was so terribly damaged by the war that occurred very difficult conditions from that of Japan and Western Europe. Under the last years of Stalin's rule, which was from 45 to 53, things were harsh. No tolerance of dissent of any kind. You had one result was huge growing of conflict of labor between 3 to 4 million people who provided a major source of cheap labor for the recovery effort. And the program was wholly state planned effort, and it generally favored a very heavy industrial agricultural production and military expenditure within that. Stalin's regime, though, does not gain any popular support by substantially lowering the price of bread or any other essentials. But the Soviet Union benefits greatly from its seizure of industrial complexes, from European art to Germany, from Germany and Poland and elsewhere. They view looting or plundering in the West. This kind of appropriation in the Soviet eyes was seen as the spoils of war. And we've talked a little bit about that spoils of war and the spoil system itself within class. Both human and material that the Nazi invasion had caused in the USSR by the mid-1950s really kind of recovered at this point in time. So, this is a kind of a new or a map of the EU, okay, or the European Union that existed here. The original members of the EU are going to be in green: Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, France, and sorry guys, had a phone call there in the middle of lecture. Anyway, going back to this, the original members of the European Union are there in the green. The new members in 1973 to 1986 are in purple. So we see the addition of Denmark, the UK, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal, also Greece down below. And the new members as of 1990 to 2017 are going to be the countries in yellow there, mainly because those are Eastern Bloc countries that were at one point in time a part of the Soviet Union, and so they would not necessarily have been added to that list as time went on until after the fall of the Soviet Union there. We also see new members who were up for candidacy, obviously in 2018, which has come and gone in there as well. Okay, so communism style, communism Chinese style, very different than the idea of the socialist, or excuse me, the Soviet Union style of communism. Europe, Japan, and the Soviet Union are all kind of emerging from the chaos that was World War II. China is also recovering from civil war, really. We know that at this point in time, the civil war that existed within China was very prominent. And we see the struggle uh, against groups like the Japanese imperialism. And in doing it, it was doing so under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party and the leader who was Mao Zedong. Um, when we look at the aspect of this as a communist country, China began its task of building socialism very differently from that of its Soviet Union. In 1917, we know the Russian Bolsheviks faced the hostile capitalist world all alone. While the Chinese communists come to power over 30 years later, they had an established Soviet Union as a kind of friendly northern neighbor and ally. Along with that, the Chinese revolutionaries actually governed parts of their huge country for decades. And so it changes these things. So as we look at this idea behind building a modern society, China follows a very socialist modernization at first. So we see in the 1950s agriculture collectivization, or all coming together as one collectivization, was peaceful due to the Chinese Communist Party relationship with the peasants. Very much a part of that. During what was known as the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, we had this effort to mobilize China's enormous population for rapid development, much the same way, at the same time moving forward to a fully communist society with even greater degree of things like social equality and such. Their industrialization program is going to model on earlier Soviet experience. Heavy industries, urban factories, centralized planning, and using the mobilization of women at this point in time as well. And so we see kind of the change that happens within that. So when we look at the Great Leap Forward, okay, from 1958 to 1960, it's an effort to kind of mobilize for development and move to a fully communist society here. When we look at this, it's really Mao Zedong's response to individualism, careerism, and urban bias. The Great Leap Forward generates a national catastrophe, however. It's an unprecedented human tragedy, and it temporarily discredited Mao's radicalism. You have administrative chaos that exists, disruption of marketing networks, bad weather, all combining to produce a massive famine, the worst really in human history, according to some scholars, somewhere around 30 million people or more between 1959 and 1962. Nonetheless, though, okay, in the mid 1960s, Mao launches yet another campaign, the Great Proletarian, and it's more the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, more known throughout history as the Cultural Revolution. It's really Mao's effort to kind of combat capitalist tendencies that he believed kind of penetrated even the highest ranks of the Communist Party. So the Cultural Revolution involves new efforts to bring healthcare and education to the countryside and to kind of revigorize earlier attempts at rural industrialization. And in all these ways, Mao struggles, but with great success, to overcome the inequalities associated within China, China's modern development. And it really creates a model of socialist modernity that's very distinct from that of the Soviet Union. In this portrait here, we see that it's a Chinese poster from the 1960s, really celebrating the agricultural and industrial efforts of the Great Leap Forward. The caption itself reads, "Start the movement to increase production and practice thrift, with foodstuffs and steel at the center with great force." The great famine that accompanies this great leap will belly kind of the optimistic outlook of the poster itself. So, eliminating enemies here. Mao called for a rebellion against the Communist Party itself. Um, when we kind of look at, um, he's caught up in this idea, Mao is, of a gigantic search for enemies beginning in the late 1950s. So China become much more public, escaping the control of the leadership, really, that was particularly during the most intense phase of the Cultural Revolution. And he's convinced that many within the Communist Party had been seduced by like capitalistic values, self-seeking materialism. So he calls for this rebellion against the Communist Party. Millions of young people respond and organize as the Red Guards. All right. And this group are going to set out to rid China of those who were taking the capitalist roads. They have rallies that are in Beijing. They fan out all across the country. They attack local party and government officials, teachers, intellectuals, factory managers, all of these things. And many are sent down to the countryside for hard physical labor to learn from the peasants. Others are going to be humiliated, beaten, and sometimes even killed. And so you have rival revolutionary groups too beginning to fight with one another. And as we see violence erupting throughout the country, civil war is going to threaten China again until the military is called in. Mao's forced to call the military to restore order and the Communist Party to control. So both the Soviet terror and the Chinese Cultural Revolution badly discredits the idea of socialism and contributes really to the ultimate collapse of the communist experience that will take place at the end of the century. Not only do communist regimes bring revolutionary changes to society themselves, but the very existence is going to launch into a global conflict. You are going to have a big East versus West divide. And a term that comes up is the Cold War. Okay, that division erupts into this war that we talk about as the Cold War. The underlying conflict were the geopolitical and ideological realities of the post-war world. The Soviet Union and the United States are now the world's major political and military powers, and they replace the shattered, diminished states of Western Europe, but they represent sharply opposing views on history, society, politics, international relations. And in retrospect, the conflict seems almost inevitable. Both sides feel they are riding the tides of kind of a historical process that we see. So, the military conflict and the Cold War itself. The initial arena is going to be the Eastern Europe, where Soviet insistence on security and control clashes with the Americans and the British desires for kind of an open democratic societies with ties to capitalist economy. So Europe is the Cold War's first arena itself. Within this, we have rival military alliances that come into play. Right? NATO being one of them. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has the United States and various Western European countries together to defend themselves against any kind of Soviet aggression. And we see in 1955, the Warsaw Pact joining the Soviet Union and East European communist countries in an alliance that would intend to kind of be a counterweight to Eastern or to NATO and to prevent a Western influence on the communist bloc, as it was called. There are two very distinct ideals behind this. When we look at it, they create a largely voluntary American sphere of influence. And we see a portion of this that we call the Iron Curtain that divides those two spheres. Behind the Iron Curtain is going to be Winston Churchill's kind of view of the Soviet Union and communist countries there. The extension of communism into Asia, places like China, Korea, Vietnam, will cause conflict, as we will figure out and we understand. Um, it globalizes the Cold War and occasioned its most destructive and prolonged what are called hot wars. A North Korean invasion of South Korea in 1950 led to both Chinese and American involvement in a 3-year conflict known as the Korean War. That ends an essential standoff that left the Korean Peninsula still divided in the early 21st century. Likewise, we see in Vietnam military efforts by the South Vietnamese communists and an already communist North Vietnamese government to unify their country prompted a massive massive U.S. intervention in the 1960s. To American authorities, a communist victory would open the door to further communist expansion within Asia and beyond. And so, armed and supported by the Soviets and the Chinese, and willing to kind of endure enormous losses, the Vietnamese communists best the Americans, who were really hobbled by this growing protest at home. People were tired of war at this point in time, and they did not want to see this continue throughout. So the Vietnamese War is really going to uh, end because of the kind of ideas that are taking place within the own home of the United States. There is another third major military conflict of the Cold War era in Afghanistan, where a Marxist party took power in 1978, but will soon alienate a lot of the population. You have Soviet leaders who are delighted at the extension of communism on the southern border, but radical land reformers and efforts to liberate Afghan women really alienates the country itself. The Islamic radicals that are there, really the Soviet forces intervene militarily and are soon bogged down in war that exists. So the Soviet military intervention actually achieves very little success, much along the lines of what the United States had within Korea and Vietnam. So the USSR will eventually withdraw in 1989 under international pressure, and communist rule of Afghanistan will eventually collapse. The most haunting battle during the Cold War was one that actually never happens, and that is within Cuba. The communist regime under the leadership of Fidel Castro, he comes to power in the early 1960s. And a tense American hostility to this nearby outpost of communism prompts the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, who's come to power after Stalin's death in 1953, to secretly deploy nuclear-tipped Soviet missiles to Cuba, believing that that would deter further U.S. action against Castro. When the missiles are discovered in October of 1962, the world really holds their breath, during this time period for 13 days as the American forces are going to blockade the island and prepare for an invasion. A nuclear exchange between the superpowers seemed pretty much imminent at this point in time. It had been building up earlier. We have things like the Bay of Pigs invasion that had taken place. That was a failed attempt by the U.S. to use Cuban nationalists to go in and destroy Castro and the Cuban ideals there. Um, Eventually, there's a compromise between Khrushchev and President John F. Kennedy. Under the terms, the Soviets will remove their missiles from Cuba, and in return for an American promise not to invade the island. The promise was kept, and the communist regime goes ahead and persists in Cuba, though a lot changes into the 21st century. So on this map here, the Cold War is kind of witnessing this sharp division between the communist world and sort of the Western democratic world. Anyone in the yellow on this map here is going to be a NATO country. Anyone in green is going to be a country from Warsaw Pact countries. And then the light green is anyone within the realm of other communist countries. And then we have a first members of what's known as the non-aligned movement in that. So, nuclear standoff and a third world rivalry. There really becomes this arms race. The USSR succeeds in acquiring nuclear weapons in 1949. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis gives concrete expression to the most novel and dangerous dimensions of the Cold War, which was the arms race. By 1989, the world has nearly 60,000 nuclear warheads with complex delivery systems, so on and so forth. These nuclear weapons are all now in play. It looks as if we are headed towards some semblance of nuclear war. The hope is that that will not happen. However, that is the fear. So from 1949 to 1989, there's fear of massive nuclear destruction and even the possible extinction of what was humankind at this point in time. Both sides, okay, East and West, know how serious their destructive power was. There's careful avoidance towards nuclear provocation, especially after 1962, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's an avoidance of any direct military confrontation, though they continue to build up their arsenals. Both sides do. The United States and the Soviet Union within the Cold War actually never face off military to military. That is one thing they don't do. Now, they do supply arms for different groups of people, but it's never military to military. Both the United States and the USSR is going to court third world countries, meaning they want them as a part of their sphere of influence. The United States is going to intervene in Iran, the Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, the Congo, and elsewhere because of fear of communist penetration. The United States would often support corrupt authoritarian regimes as well, so as to not have communism come about. So mainly the things that the United States doesn't like, which is authoritarian rulers who are going to cause havoc amongst their countries, the United States actually supports them. There's also many third world countries that resist being used as pawns as well. So some countries like India claim this non-alignment status within the Cold War itself. And some try to actually play the superpowers against one another too. Here we see the hydrogen bomb. This is the explosion of the hydrogen bomb during the 1950s and early 60s. Tests in the atmosphere, ever larger and more sophisticated. The hydrogen bomb is images of these enormous fireballs that we can see here on the screen. Mushroom-shaped clouds, kind of the universal symbol of those weapons that existed. They're immensely more powerful than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. The American test that's here takes place in 1957. So this is the American test of the hydrogen bomb. In this portrait here, this is Fidel Castro in the mountains of Cuba in 1957 as a fighter. Here, obviously different from who he looks like later on in his lifetime. Okay, the Cold War and the superpowers. The United States became the leader of the West against communism after World War II, and they were sustained by economic and increasing the middle class. There's no physical destruction on our own soil, which was a huge part of this as well. And there's it's really one of the most productive economies that it is. The communist states, however, are in a little bit of turmoil. Stalin's crimes are coming to light in the mid-1950s. Reform movements that exist within Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland against the Soviet-dominated communist governments are there. And we have growing conflict among communist countries. Yugoslavia will reject Soviet domination. Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1968 to kind of crush any kind of reform movement. As we look, we see early 1980s, Poland is also threatened with their invasion. And there is a brutal suppression of uh, a brutal suppression of what was this kind of reformed, tarnished image of Soviet communism, and it gives credence to the Western views of the Cold War. There's also some sharp opposition between the USSR and China that stems from the nuclear arms. And when China went to war against communist Vietnam in 1979 as well. Vietnam actually invades communist Cambodia in the late 1970s. So the world communism reaches their greatest extent within the 70s, and then we start to see the fall of these different groups and these areas.